Judge, in this final negative speech of the round, I want to go down through my opponent's arguments and demonstrate why, at the end of the day, equity and freedom must be valued equally in order for an economy to function properly and in order to truly uphold human rights. So to start out, I want to respond to the two primary things that this debate has boiled down to. What is freedom and what is equity? Because this is a really big issue. So to start out, I want to talk a little bit about freedom. Now, my opponent's speech, he differentiated between natural freedom and freedom within a society, and I certainly agree there is a difference. But I need to point something out here. He talks about the fact that natural freedoms are essentially God-given, that they aren't given by other people, and I agree. And he said that when you enter a society, government is created and sets up limits and enforces limits in order to ensure all people's rights are protected, and I agree. His main point here was that the government's job is to enforce limits that already exist. The problem here is the limits that already exist are limits put in place by equity. Freedom is naturally limited by other people's equal rights, equal freedoms, which is exactly at the core of what equity is. Equity says that all people's rights and freedoms must be equal because all people are equally valuable. So we find that in a society, government exists to enforce the limits on freedom, but those limits that already existed are there because of equity. As pointed out in my quote from Thomas Jefferson, where he stated that the only limit on freedom is other people's equal rights, which is exactly what equity is all about. I wanted to point this out because we need to realize that equity and freedom work together, that there's a relationship between them, and that there's no inherent conflict here. Next, I want to talk a little bit about equity. So equity is a very obviously important concept in today's round, and there's been a lot of debate about what it means. So first I want to talk about technical definitions. Now, I have proposed a counter definition in my speech, and my opponent has essentially called that into question. I would first off like to point out that my definition is not a broad or vague definition. It actually is a definition from a reliable source, and it's a definition of economic equity from the Business Dictionary. And it's all about the reality of fairness and justice. But even if we were to accept my opponent's definition, it's still based on justice. Now, my opponent said that social justice is different from justice because it's subject to different interpretation. The problem is we're not talking about how people interpret definitions. We're not talking about how people interpret justice. As my opponent said at the very beginning of his first speech, for the purpose of clarity, we're looking at things as closely to their definition as possible. So we're not looking at the definitions and then trying to find out how it actually works. Rather, we're assuming that things play out in society the way they should according to their definition. My opponent and I have both agreed on this. So the reality is, social justice may sometimes be interpreted differently, but that doesn't matter in this round because what we're talking about is the way justice should be. We're looking at whether the way justice is meant to play out in a society, not necessarily how it has played out in the past. So either definition is based on the idea of justice and fairness. So I need to talk about this a little bit more. Now, my opponent has essentially claimed that equity leads to freedom, and that it's essentially the purpose of the end goal of equity is to uphold freedom. He claims because I was saying equity's purpose is to protect human rights. The problem is, freedom is just one human right. Now, the reality of the situation is, freedom is not the only goal of equity. Freedom is one thing that equity protects. I value my mom, and my mom makes me dinner every day. But I don't value dinner more than I value my mom. My mom is the source of the dinner that I eat, but that's certainly not the only benefit she provides. It's a good thing, but it's not the reason I value my mom, and it certainly isn't more valuable than my mom. In the same way, freedom is one thing that equity protects, but it certainly isn't the ultimate goal of equity. It's one side effect of equity that is certainly a good thing. It's a byproduct that we certainly want, but it is not the reason equity exists. The purpose of equity is to uphold human rights, of which there are many, which all boil down to the idea of life, liberty, and property. Now, my opponent will probably come up here and claim that those aren't relevant in the realm of economics, but the reality of the situation is, even though we're looking at freedom and equity within the realm of economics, economic equity serves to uphold not only economic freedom, but freedom in general, life in general, liberty in general, and property in general. The purpose of equity is to uphold all human rights. Why is this significant? Because the value in today's round is human rights. Ultimately, what we're trying to achieve today is human rights, and we're asking which side better upholds this. Now, as I've demonstrated, freedom and equity work together, and there's no inherent conflict between them. Now, my opponent has given this example of vanilla and flour in a recipe, and I agree that it is possible for one thing to be valued above something else when there isn't conflict. I'm not saying the lack of conflict is the reason that they should be valued equally. I'm simply pointing out that there's no inherent conflict between them, and we don't need to choose between them for that reason. I'd also like to point out that this example of vanilla and flour is still requiring you to choose one over the other, which creates conflict. If you're choosing flour or vanilla in a recipe, if you're trying to decide which one is more valuable, that creates a natural conflict. So the reality is, when we're looking at the situation, we're looking at the reality that freedom and equity don't conflict, but furthermore, they need each other. They're mutually dependent on one another. If you value freedom, you must value equity equally. And if you value equity, you must value freedom equally. Because without freedom, equity serves very little purpose, because the purpose of equity is to help uphold human rights, of which freedom is a large part. On the other hand, if you value freedom, you must value equity, because freedom can't function without it. Because if people don't all have equal freedoms, then a society can't be truly free. So what does all this boil down to? It boils down to the reality that the purpose of equity, as my opponent and I have both talked about, is to uphold human rights. The purpose of equity in every context is to ensure that the rights of every individual are protected. Rights such as life, liberty, and property. And it is for this reason that I still stand resolved that equity and freedom must be valued equally in an economy. Thank you, and it's been a pleasure speaking for you.